Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski. Today on the podcast, we are in Pennsylvania. Somebody who's taken a roundabout way to get there, a high school phenom runner, and someone who was part of the Boulder running scene in the 80s. Welcome on the podcast today, Steve Francis. Hi, Steve.
I'm Matt. Happy to be here. You really piqued my interest when you gave me a call. I haven't talked about some of this stuff for decades, so thank you.
Excellent. Let's introduce you from the perspective of your earliest days as a competitor or athlete. How, when, and why did you get involved in competitions of any kind and your first running?
I think, as happens with a lot of young athletes, they go out for a team. I went out for a team in junior high school. I just remember going out there on a March afternoon at 2:30, and by 4:00, I had found something I could really do well. And I grabbed it and I hung on to it for dear life, which is really part of years later when I retired. I realized just how much my identity was tied into being a runner and athlete. I had a lot of buddies. All my friends were on the track team, started running cross country in 10th grade at the high school. And so we were running all year round. And by the time I was a senior at Arlington High School in Grange, New York, we were running probably twice a day, 3 or 4 days a week. That was something really new. It was good and bad. When I went to college at NC State, we were running initially probably too much, because back in that time, the thought was the more you ran, the better you were. So guys were running 100, 110 miles a week. That's what we knew back then. That was the state of the training information. We were really guessing at it at that point. So that was 1977 to 82 as at NC State.
Let's go back to high school and your earliest days. What was the state of the sport as far as your worldview? Were you aware of the bigger sport of track and field and cross country? And what were the facilities, equipment, coaching experience you had in your start in New York?
That I was aware of the wider world of track and field. My father had run track. He was quarter mile at the St. John's Prep in Brooklyn, New York. He anchored his mile relay at the Penn Relays. He could run a 50 flat quarter. He showed me these old black and white photos, and that was probably my introduction to it. I didn't have any great aspirations. I just found something I could do, and I went for it. We were running on cinder tracks with very old equipment that nowadays a kid would not put on their feet because they'd be afraid they'd probably cripple themselves. The spikes were pretty big spikes, in some cases an inch long. The technology in running shoes wasn't there at all. My first pair of spikes was by a company named Spot Built, and they were made of kangaroo skin. That's what it said anyway. It was probably some kind of synthetic. And they fit like a glove, and they really felt good on my feet when I was racing. But the rest of the time we were running in kind of early on running shoes. I remember running in Tiger, which is now ACC. It was a very light nylon blue upper and a very thin white. There was no midsole at all. It almost looked like a racing shoe. They wore out in about 6 or 8 weeks, and we would have to go buy at the local sporting goods store. They had a small section of shoes, primitive running shoes. That was way before you ever saw anybody out running. Luckily,
What was your reaction of people when you were out running? Were you running on the roads? What people think of you?
we were high school kids, so it wasn't unusual to see high school kids doing odd stuff. I didn't live far from the high school, so seeing groups of high school kids, if you were out running, you were considered to be a high school kid. No one else did it. We had cotton sweats, which, now would cause hypothermia. Our indoor season at the high school was actually a parking lot. We didn't have a track. The coach would mark off kind of an oval in the parking lot, And I remember having to get up really early for a Saturday morning indoor meet that was on the parking lot. We had to get out there early because there were 6 inches of snow on the ground and we had to shovel the track off.
Wow, that's brilliant. What was your coaching like?
My high school coach is a guy named Bill Murphy, who was a great head coach. He was an excellent head coach. He coached the football team. He coached the indoor season and outdoor track. When I was in junior high school in seventh grade, I met a guy named Terry Horton. Terry was a star. Terry was 28 years old at the time. He was an assistant coach up at the high school. Terry had probably the best approach to coaching high school runners I've seen. And I really credit Terry with having done such a great job because I remember every day before practice, after class, we'd walk down to the locker room, go into his office. We'd say, Coach, what are we doing? He would say, how do you feel? So he'd be taking our temperature about how tired are you? The distance runners in high school had a reputation. There were three of us really who led the show with distance running in high school. Myself, Richie Hansen, and Danny Lyon. We just had this dynamic where we were constantly chomping at the bit and competing with each other every second of practice. It worked for us. It really worked. That's not the kind of environment that's really very pleasant, but for some reason it worked for me and it worked for the other two guys because it was, if I slipped up, Richie would step right behind me. And literally I have pictures of winning a race. Here's a good example. I pulled these pictures. I don't know if you can see them. I can scan these in, but if
A
you
little
see,
higher. Yeah.
okay, that's me winning the Marist College 3 mile race in high school. If you look over my shoulder, you can see the shoulder of Richie. He's right behind me.
It looks like he's less than 6 feet away. Yeah.
Oh, very much. It was that close all the time, all the time. When I ran the last race as a senior, I ran 3:48.4 for 1,500 meters down at the University of Tennessee as a high school senior. Richie was 3:48.7. So he was 0.3 of a second behind me. Two kids going under a 4:10 for a mile from the same high school. It was ridiculous. That was in the trial heat to get to the final. That wasn't even a final. The year in high school, we had a phenomenal amount of talent. The high school year I graduated in 1977. The Penn relays my senior year, I ran the 2 mile. I ran 9:06 and I was eighth. All I wanted to do was get off the track because the first three guys, John Gregoric, John Tuttle, some other guys, maybe Tom Camion, they were like 8:55. It was just crazy. I think that was the case back then because kids had just a few choices in sports in middle school and high school. It was track, it was baseball, football, basketball. We didn't have lacrosse. By the time I graduated high school, we had a soccer team, but that wasn't like it is now. Kids had fewer choices. So we had 110 or 115 kids come out for outdoor track.
Wow. What about the identity? Your two closest competitor teammates, were they in the same situation with their identity as runners was solid, or were they one sport athletes like you?
We all three of us focused on track by the time we got to 10th grade. Richie was probably the best all-around athlete. He was a good basketball player, a good football player, but he focused on track. I don't think so much Rich, but Dan's identity as a distance runner was very much a part of his identity too. He'd probably tell you that to this day. Dan was probably the smartest runner. He probably didn't have as much innate talent, but he was so clever and smart about his training. I said this to him not so long ago. I said, I wish I was as smart as you. I probably would have done better. And Dan and I actually went to NC State together. We were roommates for 4 years. To this day, Raleigh Geiger down at NC State, who's still the coach, will say Danny Lyon was the best deal NC State ever got because he wasn't on a scholarship. He was a good student. He went there for the electrical engineering and he was always consistent second, third man on the cross country team. So he did very well. Rich went
Let
to
me go.
Alabama on a scholarship.
Let me ask you about that identity you had as a runner, and when you going to the Penn relays, obviously you were on a lot of people's radar. How early did it occur to you that this was going to be something you would do after high school? And what was your recruiting experience like?
Very early on, I grabbed hold of this because prior to really finding out that I could run, I was a kid who was a little bit lost and really couldn't do anything right. When I found out that here's something I could do right, and I was good at it, clearly. So I started running in seventh grade. And then by ninth grade indoor season, I set a national record for ninth graders for 1,000 yards. I ran 2:24 for 1,000 yards indoors at West Point. They had a great facility, Tartan track. They have a much better facility now, I'm sure. But at that time, that was probably one of the better indoor facilities in the country. It wasn't an indoor board track like even the Melrose games at the time, which I ran as a senior in high school. That was an invitational mile. That was a 160-yard board track that was very banked. It was difficult. That's a whole nother story. Very early on, I realized I'm going to hang on to this as long as I can. And I probably hung on to it a little too much. Years later in therapy, I'm trying to separate my identity from being an athlete. And every single athlete I've known has struggled with that, where it becomes very much a part of their identity. And then when the show is over at anywhere from 28 to 35, it's now what do I do with myself? And it really is startling.
That's exactly one of the main drivers of why I started talking to people about this because of discussions about that. What about recruiting? Who approached you and how'd you make that decision?
I got Christmas cards from every single big track powerhouse in the country. I had stacks of letters, Kansas, Villanova, Oklahoma, everywhere. I wasn't the best student in the world. I managed to get through high school B's, like a B average, but I couldn't have gotten into a Duke or something like that. Everybody back then wanted to go to Villanova because Villanova was the powerhouse. The 3 years in high school, we would have a 2 mile relay at the Penn relays and we were competitive. We did well. Everyone would look forward to watching the championship distance medley relay that the college guys would run at the Penn relays. And Jim Elliott was coaching at Villanova, and he had an amazing reputation. You would see the timers, the Villanova timers, like they had a whole team of assistant guys sitting there timing every single high school kid. They knew who they were. So they knew they were cherry picking the best people from my year. Now, of course, who they got for my year was Don Page, who was just a phenomenal athlete. And I ran against Don a number of times. Never beat Don. He beat me pretty handily. But the recruiting, I spent a lot of time on the phone in late my junior year and early senior year in the fall. My coach, Bill Murphy, wanted to get me signed someplace by Christmas of my senior year. So I knew where I was going. I forget exactly when I signed, but a lot of coaches talked to me. But NC State's the only place that sent a contract and said, if you sign on the dotted line, you get 5 free years. My coach said you should do that. And that's why I did it. I took his advice. It worked out very well. So it was a good thing. I think that I'm just thinking here, if I wanted to go back and say anything about the coaching in junior high or high school, junior high, you're so young at that point. It's just a matter of getting kids out there and keeping them active and out of trouble for the most part. But high school, it really did start to get very competitive. I noticed that I could feel the pressure in high school, and the pressure was self-imposed. At that point, we were running fast enough that I loved stepping to the starting line. It was a charge. I'm an ADHD guy, and we didn't know back then. Nobody knew there was no such thing as that. But every single guy that I competed with in college and after college all had some psychological burr in their past that was spurring them on to run as much as they were running. It's not normal. I've always said that to compete at Division I NCAA level in any sport, you have to be pathologically driven. And what I mean by that is it really has to be the main driver in your life. I've seen a lot of kids wash out, not because they didn't have the talent, but because they just weren't willing to go out and give it 110% every day. Now, luckily,
And maybe to the detriment of other areas in their life.
absolutely. It's funny when I moved out to Boulder, Boulder puts on a wonderful race called the Boulder Bowler. It's one of the bigger races in the country. And it was run initially by a guy named Steve Bosley, who ran the Bank of Boulder. When I graduated from NC State, Ed Hine, a buddy of mine who I met through Richie at the University of Alabama, I called him and he said, "What are you doing after college?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm open. I'm looking at a number of things." And he said, "Why don't you come out to Boulder for a couple of weeks?" So I went out to Boulder for 2 weeks and I stayed for 5 years. But I was working for Frank Shorter, making $5.25 an hour selling running shoes in his running store, which is a whole nother story, a whole nother thing that went on at that time. And Steve Bozick came in to buy a pair of shoes and he liked talking to the runners. And he said to me, "I give anything to run as fast as you do." And I said, "That's good because you would give everything. You would give everything. It's just, that's pretty much what I'm doing now. It's like, could I go get a corporate job? Sure. But that's not my priority right now. I really wanted to squeeze every bit of talent I could out of myself to see if I can qualify for the Olympic team, all that kind of stuff."
Let me just get, as this chronology goes, as you go to NC State, how did you handle that transition? It sounds like the running burden wasn't worse in terms of mileage. What about the academics and adjusting to that?
Absolutely. That was especially challenging for me. Luckily, I had a great roommate in Danny Lyon. He's a great student. He's just natural. He's smart. He was the smartest of the three of us, clearly. And I was studying psychology as a major. I was very intimidated by the academics and really studied a lot. It was not easy for me. I think what got me through my first year, which was really disruptive because I went from high school being king of the hill and being the best on the team. When I was recruited, I went down there and we ran a race. Dan and Rich and I ran a race at NC State where they had high school invitational mile. And it was on a board track and it wasn't anything spectacular, but it was fun to go down there and we stayed. The athletic department could not guarantee housing at NC State for the athletes, which is a problem at a big sports school because that includes football players and basketball players. So the athletic department bought a hotel and they housed the athletes in this hotel. It was really a motel, a two-story motel. It was U-shaped, had a 2-level parking garage in the middle of it. It was across the street from the college. It was great. We had 2 guys to a room, controlled our own air conditioning and heat. We had a maid came in and cleaned our room every Thursday. We had a swimming pool. If we wanted tutors, we just told the coach, "You need a tutor." A tutor shows up at our door in the evening. We had our own meal plan. There was no meal plan on the campus. The students pretty much worked it out for themselves, but the athletes had Case Athletic Center, which was meal plan for the athletes. And it was great. They had steak night. A restaurant would come in every Thursday night and cater it. And we were a lot of what you hear about privileges for athletes at universities is very true. Nowadays, it works because athletes bring in a lot of revenue. We, we were a non-revenue sport, track and field. So what that means is we don't get a lot of things back then, back in 77 to 82. The track locker room was in a hallway on the way to the football players' weight room. So as the football players walked by and we were changing, we'd have to kind of step out of their way. They were the royalty. They brought in the money. And now it's very different. The facilities are very impressive. Track is, I was just blown away by the facilities they have for all sports now. So what was remind me what your question was.
What about the psychological change? Your identity as a runner is still strong, but going from top man, how did you do as a competitor? And how did you psychologically adjust in NC State?
I finished second in the Atlantic Coast Conference 1500 meter as a freshman. I finished second as a senior. It was a very frustrating kind of thing. The margins of improvement weren't as great. I was very concerned about that. I was really clear that if I don't perform, my scholarship gets taken away. And that's
Oh,
understandable. I didn't have any illusions about that. There was a guy on the team. His name is John Michael. He was loaded with talent. His brother, Hal Michael, was actually one of the premier milers in the country, like a generation before. He was a major competitor with Marty LaCouri. But John had the talent, but John was not a guy who was really devoted to it. And he ended up washing out his junior year and leaving the team. But we were running against Duke, Clemson, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech. It was pretty nerve wracking, a lot of pressure. And the coaching was not what it is today by any stretch of the imagination. The coaches were really doing the best they could, guessing. When I went to NC State initially, Jack Batchelor, who was a two-time Olympian, he ran on the marathon team with Kenny Moore and Frank in 1972 in Munich. And he also ran in 1968. He made the team for 5,000 meters, I believe. You can always see pictures of Jack in 72 starting the marathon because he's 6'4". So he was the tallest guy in the field. And Jack, because he was 6'4", he was running 110 miles a week, 15 to 17 miles a day. That's what they needed to do. And it worked for Jack and his body type. I'm, I was what, 5'9", 140 pounds. I didn't need that, but we didn't know that back then. We were really tired all the time. We were probably way overtrained. Had no days of rest. Our rest day was a long run on Sunday, a long, slow run, which was 15 or 17 miles, but that's not a rest. So what they know now, when Raleigh Geiger now brings in the freshmen, they're not even running twice a day their freshman year. And they're testing them for athleticism. And if they don't pass the athleticism kind of all around strength, they redshirt them because if they're not all around strong, they're prone to injuries. And a kid
yeah.
who's injured for 3 years isn't going to be good for the university. So they rather take them and have them work with the athletic trainers and get fit before they put them out on the starting line kind of thing.
Let's go right to your moving to Boulder. What did you own? What did you have with you? What's the status of a Division I scholarship athlete? What'd you have in the bank? And what did it take to have you stay in Boulder?
I left NC State and I drove up to New York. I had a 1969 Volkswagen Bug. I think it was sky blue. And I put everything I owned in it, which did not go above the bottom of the windows, clothing, basically, running. I think my parents gave me $1,000 deposited into my bank account as a graduation gift. And that's pretty much everything I had. I drove out there with no place to stay. Ed Hine was my contact. I showed up. I gave Ed a call. This is before cell phones. He met me. I said, "Hey, I'm at the Denny's right off the highway here." He came out and we drove to this house in Boulder. I think there were 5 other runners living in the house. Gary Crossan, I know Gary from running other road races, and Randy Liljenberg, Jerry Maris. I forget who else was in that house. And then Ed and I looked for an apartment together. And so we got an apartment. The running in Boulder, there were 3 places to be at that period of time, 3 towns: Boulder, Colorado, Boston, or Eugene. There were so many good runners in Boulder at the time: Benji Durden, Rob DiCostella, Yoel da Silva, who was a South American Olympic runner. There were a handful of British club runners who were astonishingly good: Mark Anderson, Mark Muggleton, of course, Gary Crossan, Rick Musgrave, who was an amazing athlete. I'm forgetting some of the other guys' names. I can picture them, but Herb Lindsay, Stan Mavis, Steve Flanagan, Mike Buman, who is an amazing thing. When we were working at Frank Shorter Fitness Wear, we were one of the premier places to go because we had a video cassette tape with races on the tapes, and we'd put it in, and with the TV was featured tube, CRT tube. And that was pretty special back then. We had a video of Mike Buman missing making the Olympic team in 10,000 meters by 1/100th of a second. And it was played over and over and over. Um, and there were pictures. A lot of it was Frank running in Munich with the videotapes we play there. I didn't have a job when I went out to Boulder either. And I interviewed at a bunch of different places, and I ended up luckily getting a job working for Frank again for 525. And that was an interesting environment. There were runners coming from all over the country to live in Boulder and to train in Boulder. It's at 5,500 feet altitude, so it's just enough to make a difference. The difference that we would see on the track, if you could run 8 quarters in 58 with 200 yards jog, 58 seconds, at altitude, you were running anywhere between, with the same effort, probably 60 to 62 seconds. It was a pretty dramatic difference. It took me a while to get adjusted um, to the altitude. Later, like a few years later, when I was running the road race circuit, I ran the Cascade runoff. I finished out of the money like 11th or 12th, and 14 of the top 15 runners were altitude trained runners in that race. And that was a huge race. It could have gone to anybody in the top 20 at that point, just depending on the day. I spent a year working for Frank Shorter, racing and having a good time. It was a lot of fun. Everybody was very young. I think the average age in Boulder was 28 years old. It was full of cyclists, world-class cyclists. They had the Coors International Bicycle Classic every summer there. That was a huge event, along with the Boulder Boulder. You'd run into some very interesting characters in Boulder, some world-class rock climbers because of the climbing is right there. 300 sunny days a year. The rest were partly cloudy. I don't ever remember waking up to rain. It was just beautiful all the time.
Let me ask you about one thing you mentioned there was finishing just out of the money. How was the money coming in to play there at the road races?
Once I got to college, I spent the next 10 years not paying for running shoes or equipment or anything. I signed a contract while I was in college with Converse. They had a racing team. We went out in 1981. I ran the TAC cross country nationals in Los Angeles. So I got free gear. Most of the athletes were in what I called a wear test program. We beta test shoes for, just doing it for Converse. I did it for Brooks. They'd send us the shoes and equipment. We'd wear the shoes. We'd document certain things, and we'd send the shoes back after 6 or 8 weeks with our notes on them. And they'd look at the wear on the bottom. We'd have to tell them, they could see, they just turn the shoe over. They could see I was a midfoot striker. And so that's pretty much how I got most of my running gear. They would pay for a certain number of airfare and accommodations to road races, which probably meant 6 or 8 big road races a year. They'd fly me out, and you just keep track of your expenses and submit it, and they reimburse you. If I broke even making money, I was a good national caliber athlete. I was not a world-class athlete. And I was running road races in Boulder and flying around the country during the warm season. And Boulder had a lot of races, just pickup races that were ridiculously fast, right?
Yeah.
So that's what pretty much where I got my resources. I got myself into graduate school at the University of Colorado after a year because I woke up one morning and said, I got to get a life here. I'm having a great time and I know I'm in great shape, but I'm not going to make it's not going to pay my bills, which is so much the case. Unless you were one of the top 5 distance runners in the country, you really weren't picked up. There was no real solid program. Herb Lindsay was probably the best athlete in town in the road race circuit at that time. And he was running for Athletics West. If you were on Athletics West, you were just good. And you knew if you showed up at a road race and there was a guy with an At West singlet on, you were going to have trouble. If you could beat him, that would be amazing. I showed up in Boston once. This At West guy shows up and I look at him. He doesn't quite look like as fit as I would guess. I ran against him. I beat him soundly. And after the race, I came over, I shook his hand. I said, are you with At West? He said, no, I stole this from John Gregoric at a race.
That's great. Yeah,
So you're not an out West guy. So, no, I just wear it to scare people.
that's great. How did you pick who you would train with out there, and how would the schedule work? Was it the guys working at Shorter's store, or who did you train with?
So that's a good question. Who you trained with was really important. I was careful to train with the guys who had the right attitudes. Herb Lindsay trained alone. He wouldn't train with any of us. Looking back on it, it got to a point where in Boulder, if you wanted to train, you could show up at the Boulder High School track at 4:30 in the afternoon. Usually somebody was there. I got to know Benji Durden pretty well. I got to know Rob DiCostella. I think Rob at the time led the world in the marathon. And a good friend of mine, John Cabell, was out there. John ran for Princeton like a generation ahead of me. He still lives out in Denver. We would do almost a pickup workout. Some guys were very specific. I remember Brian Jordan, who we knew as Louie. He was training for a marathon. He would come out. He was running a series of miles in 5 minutes a mile to just get the pace down for his marathon. But you could show up there at 4:30 and talk to who was there and say, "What are you running? I'm going to run quarters, or I'm running halves," that kind of thing. And you would just make it up there. If it worked for you, if it worked into your training program, you could do it. Training at that time for a lot of guys was that way. There was no prescribed method to do it. We were all still guessing. So a guy like Rob DiCostella obviously had a formula that worked for him, and he was going to stick to the formula. Same with Benji Durd and certainly her. There was a lot of guesswork there. And when I was talking to Frank, Frank said, here's basically what works. You're running two hard interval workouts a week. The rest of the time you're running distance, you're running cadence work, but you're not going to be running hard more than twice a week. But there was never any mention of taking a day off or downtime, which now is just so critical. And sleep. Jack Batchelor at the time, he bragged about, and it worked for him. He and Frank were at the University of Florida. They started the Florida Track Club. And Jack actually designed that logo, the orange with the leaves on it. He was down there with LaCory and Frank. Frank was at law school at the University of Florida, and Batchelor was getting a PhD in entomology at the University of Florida. And why was I telling you this? I was telling you this because
The rest days.
rest days. Jack said when I was studying for my PhD, and he made the Olympic team when he was studying, both made the Olympic team. And he said, I would get up at 6 o'clock. I'd run in the morning. I'd go to school. I'd run it again in the afternoon. I'd study till midnight. I'd go to sleep at midnight and get up at 6. He was getting 6 hours of sleep a night, which is not sufficient. Okay. For some reason, it worked for him. Now, Jack clearly was a very talented athlete. He ran 27 minutes and change for 10,000 meters. It was ridiculous. That is basically what we were taught. If you can get away with less sleep, then that's all the better, because we're all trying to get established and have jobs and everything else. Now, in hindsight, we know that's not the way to do it. Ellen Hart, who was one of the best female runners in the country at the time, was working with Rich Castro. And Rich Castro worked at the University of Colorado, and he's still out there in Boulder. And he was the local liaison for elite runners coming in to the Boulder. He would house them and make sure they were taken care of and everything else. I think Rich is still pretty involved in it. She got into law school, and Rich, her coach, basically said, if you want to try to make the Olympic team, get out of law school, put it on hold and make the Olympic team. I didn't agree with that at the time. She went on to complete law school, but I don't know how long she took off. But that was a big quandary for athletes, for young athletes. Because if you look at the sports like track and field or fencing or Greco-Roman wrestling, these Olympic sports, there's really not a lot of support for American athletes at all. There wasn't back then. I don't know what there is now. There's probably more of it, but still, there isn't a formal kind of process kind of thing.
It comes in spurts when the attention Olympic years come up. Yeah. What about resistance training? And were there any people into nutrition then? When did that come in at all before your career ended?
I was always a big believer in weight training and staying all around fit. Jack Batchelor was not at all when I got to NC State. He was the opposite. In fact, he would try to chase me out of the weight room after practice. He would tell this story that a month before he made the Olympic team in the marathon, he could not do one push-up. And
I've never heard anybody brag about that who was in sports. Yeah.
yeah, it's who cares if he can do push-ups? He made the team. A lot of guys back then, there wasn't a lot of, there was no all-around fitness. There was a kid we recruited named Keith Brantley who went on to make the Olympic team in the marathon. He was a generation behind me. My junior year, he came to NC State. He ended up going to the University of Florida. And I think he ended up coaching there after his career. But at that point, those were the guys, the generation behind me, where the trainers were starting to talk about, let's do some medical testing on these guys. Let's see if we can balance their quads and their hamstrings and keep them fit longer. Raleigh Geiger came in my junior year. He was a 32-year-old young high school coach that Tom Jones, the head coach at NC State, recruited. Raleigh was coaching Betty Springs. Betty Springs was probably the best female runner in the country. He wanted to recruit Betty, and he knew that if he hired Raleigh as an assistant coach, Betty would follow Raleigh because Raleigh was coaching Betty. That changed a lot of things. Raleigh and Tom started running camp in the summers in Banner Elk, North Carolina, which is a beautiful area in North Carolina. And they would bring in medical doctors and talk to the kids about, this is what you need to do. You really need to think about what you're eating. Athletes at that time, when I was at NC State, we were notorious for eating huge quantities of food of just about anything we wanted and not caring at all about it. Part of the good thing about that is we were probably eating a lot, which was really good. Years later, I did an adventure race, the one that Mark Burnett puts on, the Echo Challenge, or he put on years ago. Took my team, I was living in Boston at the time. I took my team to listen to this guy talk named Barry Sears, who came up with the zone diet about fat, carbohydrates, and protein. You have to have 20, 30, 30%, right, of those things. We were probably getting plenty of fat at that time when I was at NC State, not knowing it. I remember going out one night, there were 6 distance runners after practice. I think 3 of the women and 3 of the men on the team. We all ordered large pizzas with extra cheese each and devoured it. And we would all eat that amount of food and wash it all down with a quart of beer. We just felt, hey, we're running, we can eat whatever we want. So that was the nature of it at the time. The training table at NC State, you had to be careful because there's a lot of the food there that was geared toward fattening up the football players and keeping weight on. So we had to be selective there.
What about Boulder? What about the dark side? That lifestyle couldn't have fit everybody. Were there some crash and burn cases post school among people? What was the social life like? Apart from running, did you have time to do anything else?
Oh, yeah. I had a great time in Boulder. I was coming from pretty conservative North Carolina State, 25% women and 75% men at NC State at the time. That was pretty dismal. Boulder was the opposite end of the spectrum. It was very liberal, highly educated, a lot of young, fit, good-looking people. I think I was in Boulder 2 weeks, and I'd already been to my second naked hot tub party. And I didn't know I was at this, that was what it was. I was at this house party, and I had a beer, and it was a little cool. It was in the fall, and I wandered out onto the deck, and there were all these naked people on the deck in the hot tub. Oh, okay. So it was that kind of thing. Were crash and burn? Yeah. I think all athletes get into that, as there were some guys who came out to Boulder with the intention of kind of living that lifestyle for a while and realizing I can't even keep up in practice. I can't hold these guys jock. I can't even show up. I think as you move up, the dirty secret that they don't tell kids about sports is to be really good. It's amazing. It's just ridiculous how good you have to be to perform at a high level. And also, you're going to sustain lifelong injuries, even in a sport like running, which is a non-contact sport. We're not talking about football here or auto racing where you can be killed. But you're going to have problems. You're going to have glitches now that you're 28. He backs out, you go to the chiropractor, he pops it back in. There was a lot of that. There was a lot of chiropractic involved. There's a lot of Aston patterning, Rolfing, experimental stuff, people talking about vitamins for the first time. There were trainers. University of Colorado had a exercise physiology program that was just beginning. Some of the young trainers worked part-time at Frank Shorter Fitness Wear, and they would be telling me things I'd never heard that before. I'd been in the sport for how many years, right? And they would look at me like, no, this is what you have to do. This is basic physiology. We were beginning to see that. It's a very difficult thing for a young athlete to realize you're not going to go to the show. You're not going to make it. You're good, but you're not as good as you think you are. And I remember making the conscious decision to retire in 1989. And really, I was out of it probably a couple of years before that. It just takes time to psychologically adjust. I noticed I was taking the bus down to Denver to go to grad school because that's where the program was, and coming back at the end of the day and it wasn't working. It just wasn't working. I remember talking to Norm Ogilvie about this, and Norm went to Syosset High School in Long Island. So I knew him from high school, and he ended up going to the University of Iowa on a scholarship, did well there. And then he ended up coaching Duke, being head coach at Duke University for track and field for a number of years. He's still involved. I saw him at the ACC championships a few weeks ago down in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was commentating. He's a commentator now for a lot of track and fields. He and I had that conversation years ago when I saw him at a cross country race. He said, yeah, that was a tough few weeks to get through because I realized the show's over. I'm not really in it, and I'm kidding myself. There's a lot of guys who try to make the Olympic team, lots of guys. I've talked to other athletes in other sports, baseball players and some football players, when they finally come to that realization that I need to move on with my life. There are some people who don't. I watched, I won't mention his name. He's a premier road racer out in the Boulder, Fort Collins area. I think he hung on to it for way too long. And it got sad because there were still magazines that wanted to talk to him and interview him. I remember reading one article, and it was just kind of, there was something really melancholy about it. It wasn't celebration of sport. And he was a good road racer. He was a legitimately good road racer, but it was very clear at the end of the article that it was time to move on, kind of thing.
How did you move on psychologically then? When you got at some point through that process, what filled the place of your identity in a major way if you weren't going to be a runner in?
Yeah. I got into a graduate program and realized getting into business is something that I was excited about. Some of my friends were successful entrepreneurs and business people. And I thought, okay, this is a different kind of charge. It's a different kind of step up. It's not as exciting. When I moved to Boston, I went on a bunch of job interviews, and probably the best question I ever got from an interviewer. Most interviewers for jobs are terrible, but she saw my resume. She saw at the bottom, I was in NC State track and field, full scholarship, and then running. I just mentioned at the bottom, and then ran professionally for 3 years. She put my resume down. She looked me in the eye and she said, "You think you'll ever do anything as exciting as that again?" And it's,
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, fish that play the dark music in the background. Yeah.
yeah. And it was a really insightful question. And we both knew what the answer was. And that's not what I said. I said, no, I can see if I work here, it'll be just as exciting. But the reality of it is, the honest answer to that is, I think if a person personally and spiritually matures as they're going along, the excitement changes. There's nothing better than stepping to the starting line with the best people in the country, and you're one of them, one of the top 20 standing there, The cameras are on, there's helicopters in the sky filming every move you make, and the gun goes off. It's astonishing. It's just the whole excitement about it is wonderful. People knowing your name, people cheering you as you're going, heading toward the finish line. And that's great. But I think that the excitement just changes as you get older. If you mature, most people do. Some people just wash out completely, hang on to it way too long, and don't really find their thing. And I've had friends turn to alcohol and drugs to get the charge. I've had a few friends die from that, which is unfortunate. It is tough. It's the hard part of being really successful. And I think you can probably map this onto any field. You get really successful in one area and then it's short lived. I remember talking to Paul Cummings, who made the Olympic team twice, ran the 10,000 meter final, 1984 Olympics in LA. And I flew in right after those Olympic games to the Falmouth road race in Falmouth, Massachusetts. And all the guys, even the foreigners, the race director for the Falmouth road race just flew all these guys in. Let's get them out of LA and get them right to Massachusetts, which made it a great, amazing race. And I'm waiting for the airport shuttle to take me to the hotel. And I noticed Paul's waiting too. And I asked him what it was like. He was really tired from the Olympics, but they were paying him to come in and to run this race. We somehow got on the topic of, because he'd been ranked high in the world. And we're talking about being on the bubble. If you're the best in the world, it's like standing on a bubble. And the bubble's really thin and it's going to burst at any time. You even look at something like Roger Bannister, who 1953 in Cambridge, England, went under 4 minutes for the first time. I think 3 weeks later, an athlete also went under four shortly thereafter. I forget the guy's name. But yeah. And that's the nature of sport, which makes it exciting. But it's like what we had in high school, to go back to that with Dan and me, and then Rich, and then Dan. It was, if I stepped out, Rich was right there. And if Rich stepped out, Dan was right. And that's just the nature of sport. And you have to have the personality who thrives in that environment. Yeah. I graduated high school with a kid who was an outstanding athlete. He was an All-American. In high school, if you're top 10 in your sport, you're considered All-American. And I was an All-American. And then this other guy, Mark, was an All-American in baseball or football, or maybe both. The guy was a remarkable all-around athlete, but he just didn't have the killer instinct. He didn't have the work ethic to want to go out and do it every single day. It's relentless. You know that even though you're doing it every single day, if you screw up, somebody else is going to take your spot in the next moment. And that's not an environment that everybody likes. Nowadays, it's really interesting. If you listen to somebody like Sydney McLaughlin, who's an amazing high hurdler.
Yeah. At the very top of the sport right now.
Right. She keeps herself from that kind of environment. And now we know you have to keep it fun. You have to do it. I ran because I simply loved to run. I loved the feeling of it initially as a kid. I found out I was good at it, which made it very attractive and drew me to it. But I did it because I simply loved it. Alberto Salazar in the 80s in the road race circuit, I remember listening to him talk to some friends. We were all out one night after a road race. He was taking sleeping pills every night for a year. No, actually, who told me this was Frank Shorter. And at that point, it's just not fun anymore. You're doing it for the wrong reasons. If I was heading toward the finish line, counting my places and adding up the money that I was going to win in the place that if I get one more guy, I get $2,000 more. That's not why I'm doing it. You have to stay pure to why you're doing it. I think some of the young athletes now we're seeing, particularly the women, Parker Valby, Caitlin Toohey, Sydney McLaughlin, they know what it's like to do it for the right reasons. And that's what keeps the pressure off them personally.
Or at least to the tolerable level. It's very interesting. Of course, the general public or civilians, non-athletes, people have all kinds of pressures in their lives. And there's the famous passages that everybody in this generation's gone through. But maybe there's another passage for people that are hyper competitive or hyper performance people. There's that other passage that can come at any point in their life. What about the idea of competition? Yeah, it sounds like you had a healthy adjustment. Maybe it dragged on a little bit, maybe wasn't how you say I could have done it a couple different ways. But what about not the thrill of the spotlight? Do you still have the drive to compete in anything?
I'd love to. I'd love to. But the most relaxing thing I could do when I was 28 to 32, if I was stressed, I'd just go out and run 8 miles and everything would be fine. I can't run anymore because body parts wear out and some parts you can't replace. So I just stop and I stay fit, but I don't do that kind of thing. I would love to, mainly because at this point it would clear my head. But I've done enough work in therapy and I work as a psychotherapist right now. So I'm really doing things for different reasons. I don't really need to go out and conquer the world or climb a mountain or that kind of thing. In 96, I mentioned I organized a team for that adventure race at the Echo Challenge. That was probably my last hurrah into kind of traditional competitive athletics. And that was a 364-mile race, teams of 5. It took us 9 days, 7 hours and 36 minutes to finish it. We carried our own gear. We had a couple of transition areas where we got assistance, but it was a completely different event. Did it with military team guys. And I did that event because running is an individual sport. And a few years after running road races, I said to my sister, I said, my life's all about me. And she said, no shit, Steve, really? And it was like, when you're an individual athlete, your life is all about you. And for a good reason. Everybody's always asking you, when's your next race? How did you do in your last race? All this, it's all about the athlete. And that's fine for that period of time. But then, when you get older, you're never going to succeed in business being necessarily all about you. You've got to take into consideration, I've got clients I have to take care of, or I have employees I have to take care of, and I have to think about them. My thinking and being has to be bigger than me. Luckily, I've had a lot of people in my life as mentors, Raleigh Geiger being one of them, Terry Horton being one of them, Bill Murphy, of course, Jack Batchelor, and then some academic over the years, and just having gotten a number of degrees and working in higher education, being exposed to people. You just have to be open to that. The thing about sports is it occurs at such a young developmental stage for people, a young age, and it is so seductive and so intoxicating. And it really appeals to that young person with the notoriety and the popularity and the flashiness. The rest of life is not that sparkly. It's different. It's a different kind of success. It's a different kind of satisfaction. And it's not as short-lived. It's not as short-lived as a 3-mile race or a mile race. It might be 10 years as an entrepreneur before you begin to see your success. 10 years. Whoa. You tell somebody who's 25, forget it.
Let's talk about a couple things. The ailments. We probably all have friends who have AFib and new hips and new knees and cemented backs. Has it taken a toll on you? You are able to stay fit.
Yeah, I've been exceptionally lucky with my health. I don't have any major complaints as a result of the running. I think one of the reasons that worked for me is I never competed in a marathon. Jack Batchelor told me, I was a freshman in college and here was this Olympic marathon guy. And he said, do you want to run a marathon? I said, yeah, coach, I want to run a marathon. I said, why? And I said, what's the thing to do? And he said, if you can run a fast mile or fast 5K, don't run a marathon. I said, why not? He said, because it's the most horrible experience I've ever had in my life. And I said, what?
I only ran one. I was a mile or two. I only ran one and I agree with him. And that stopped me. Yeah. Wow. That's interesting to hear from a successful athlete.
Yeah. And so Jack told this story about after he ran the Olympic marathon, he was so beat up, but he went into the bathroom to pee and he pees and what he peed out was blood. He said, it scared me to death. It was terrible. And I said, how did you fix that? He said, next time I beat, I just turn the lights out. And that's kind of a statement of what we knew about the science back then too, right? I think Frank and those guys were drinking at the aid stations flat Coke. That's what made sense back then, I think. But yeah, I have friends, Muggs, who's had hip replacements. Body parts wear out, and you've got to be careful. I don't know the physiology behind this, but we have odometers like a car. And if you beat yourself up a lot, it's going to take its toll over time.
You don't get to trade in the whole unit here so far.
Like, yes.
Yeah. Now that you brought up mugs again, what was your experience? Were you there when the dungeon was a part of Boulder?
I really came after the dungeon. The dungeon, I think that there's a movie to be made about the behind the scenes in the heyday of running. I think every sport's got this kind of genre movie of the really what's going on behind the scenes and how it was a seat of the pants operation. And lo and behold, a couple of these guys actually made it to the Olympic team or something. There are a lot of guys that living week to week, having a job, you're running out of money at the end of the week, living in this place with 5 other guys kind of thing, a lot of parties. People would show up at your door that you're like, and this happened to me a lot at Boulder where I'd go out and I'd meet a guy like Paul Chrisman. Paul Chrisman is a Boulder guy. He showed up out there. He wasn't an elite runner, but he was really interested. He was actually dating Lorraine Moeller at the time. Lorraine was a marathon runner from New Zealand who made the Olympic team in '84 for the marathon. So he was always there. I went out with him one night and I met Tom Fleming, another famous runner. They would just show up. People would just show up and they'd knock on the door of the dungeon and you open the door and there's Mary Decker. Yeah, exactly. And Matt Centrowitz was in, who is Matt Centrowitz Jr.'s father, and I knew Matt in high school. He ran for Power Memorial in New York City, and Matt ran like 4:03 or something. Matt Centrowitz Sr. as a high school kid. And then I think he went to Manhattan College or something and did okay there. But I'm trying to think about just the kind of funny stories that that you'd hear about. I was a little after the dungeon. I'd been down there, I'd seen it, but I never lived there.
You're obviously still a fan of the sport. You just
Yeah.
went to the ACC championships and you're up on who's at the top of women's track and field. What has the sport meant to you and how do you view it? How big a fan are you?
Yeah.
And let's talk, if it means something to you, let's talk about the controversies in sports now, from performance enhancing drugs, from classifications, transgender runners, all the things that are a part of sport that were, again, like nutrition and weight training, maybe not on the radar 50 years ago.
Everything you've heard about college sports, abuses in college sports is true. It's even worse than they say. I'm always astonished when an article comes out about an athlete using performance enhancing drugs. There's so much money in college sports and professional sports. There will always be people looking to cut corners. There will always be countries looking to cut corners for their Olympic athletes. It's just the nature of a highly competitive environment. I have seen abuses with performance enhancing drugs. I can talk to you off the record about certain things that I don't want necessarily recorded, but it's all true. As a weight man in track and field, like a discus thrower, or shot putter, or javelin thrower, when I was in school in 77, 82, you were not going to make it to the NCAA final without performance enhancing drugs. It was prevalent at that time. I'm a little guarded about talking about it, but there's a lot of things that I'm happy to talk to you about off the record. And if somebody walked up to me and said, listen, we're going to give you a shot and it'll increase your endurance, your capacity, give you a better shot making the Olympic team, and I'm 23 years old, I probably would have done it.
Sure.
Now, the long-term effects of that are pretty rough. I would not advise anybody do it. When you're 23 or 25, it makes sense to you because you're in a completely different state of mind. Now, the other thing is the controversies. The whole gender stuff I deal a lot with that as a psychotherapist, the gender confusion with teenage boys and girls. It is such a new thing, and it's split 50-50 among my colleagues in psychotherapy. Some people saying, no, it's a legitimate, and they support the transgender, the transitioning from one gender to the other. Others don't. I don't necessarily think it's something that a teenager should do because their brain is not developed enough to really make that kind of decision, lifelong decision. I think for men, the brain develops completely at 30. For women, it's like 25. I think in sports, I don't think that transgender male to female should be competing with women. The physiology of men and women is different, and we should celebrate the difference within those different arenas and not muddle it up, I think, with that kind of confusion. I don't think it lends credibility to those making that transition as well as the people who are in that gender. I don't want to take away anything from anybody who goes through that kind of transition. But if you're doing the sport for the right reasons, you're doing it because you enjoy it, you love it, you like the camaraderie of it, it shouldn't matter whether you should be able to compete with your original gender and be okay with it. Kind of
Yeah,
thing.
it's interesting to hear a professional slant on this that I'm sure, but much more complicated and fine and subtle than you just explained in 90 seconds, but it's very clear. You're a great storyteller,
Thank you.
Steve. It's very fun to talk to you. What else in the sport? You mentioned the mentoring you had in your personal life and sports or otherwise. You did get a team together. What has been your experience being a mentor? And did you get that from those people? How did you get the skills or the personality to do that? Being it's all about me career athlete for a long.
Yeah. You can't really effectively mentor somebody when you're all about you. It really is. I think you have to get to a certain point, legitimate maturity, and be able to be there. You have to be able to empathize well enough to get where somebody's coming from. As a therapist, the most important thing in psychotherapy is what we call the therapeutic alliance. In other words, is the client left feeling gotten? Do they think the therapist really gets where they're coming from? Not just the information, but the whole emotional landscape. And are they there with me? That's the same thing that a really good coach has to do. When I mentioned Bill Murphy and Terry Horton, I was initially coached in junior high school by a guy named Bill Wright, who was an excellent coach, spent his whole career in high school education as a teacher, gym teacher, and a coach, excellent coach. And the interesting thing is his wife was actually my kindergarten teacher. So these people have been in my life, all my life.
Wow.
I think Bill Murphy as a head coach, very old school coach. He knew what to say to athletes at the right time. That's empathy. He was your classic old kind of coach. He wasn't going to get mushy on you. He wasn't going to coddle you. He was going to be tough with you when you needed to be tough. And I feel really fortunate to have experienced that era of coaching. Now, I think kids are so coddled. And I know Muggs was coaching the Boulder High School track team for a while. And he said the biggest problem, and this is the same thing I see in the emergency department as a psychotherapist, the biggest problem for kids surviving in sports and some kids surviving, period, are the parents. They're coddling them too much. They're not saying, no, you're going to do this. And that's the way it is. It's very difficult. I'm a parent. I got a 20-year-old son. It's tough for parents now with the media and with the phones and everything else. The number one trigger that gets a teenager into the emergency room is that they do something the parents don't like. The parents take the phone away. The kid flips out, damages property, cuts his wrists, assaults somebody or assaults the parent. And now they're in the emergency department. That's the number one trigger is they take the phone because they're taking the whole life of the kid, taking the friends and everything. So it's a very complicated world for the parents. It's not easy.
We're going to lighten this back up because that is a little bit depressing. It's true, but I do want to just talk about you a little bit more. So this idea that You've gone through maturing passages, but you're in an emergency room. There's no
Yeah.
shortage of adrenaline in your life today, I suspect.
I think it's no mistake that's what I'm doing. I think that there's a charge there. And I think that's one of the characteristics that all athletes have is they love to be at the starting line or the beginning of the game or whatever that is for their sport. There's nothing better than that. It's funny. My kid has my endurance, but he has a different personality. I took him when he was a little guy. He was probably 8. And I said, "Hey, let's go do the Autobahn go-karts. It's an indoor electric go-kart race." He's looking around and I got him into the cart and they give you a helmet and everything else and they line you all up and he's queued up as the ground at the track first. And I looked down at him through the visor and it was like he had cued into it. He was like, he was in it. I'd never seen the look on his face like that before. He was into it. This is now since that time, we've gone out to the track a number of times. And when we travel around, we find a track and that's what turns him on. And that's what it takes for, I think, for all athletes to really be charged up for it. And that's the exciting part of it. And you have to know yourself well enough to, and how can I do that now at my age of 65? So I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's great to talk and get to know you a bit, Steve. And I think, like you say, there's nothing like it. For me, there's nothing like talking to people like you. We're all battle scarred,
Yeah.
come out better, have great stories. You have a great attitude towards the past, and it gives you a good insight with your vocation of
Yeah.
psychology to understand and be able to talk about athletes. I think a lot of people will find this very relatable. There'll be a lot of people find it pretty fun to hear the names that you've gone through, and you were at that high level for such a long time and
Yeah.
at these places. It'll be great to hear. I look forward to turning off the recording and talking about some of the scenes that'll go into the dungeon movie that we can't talk about. I'll talk about when I went to the Olympics as a journalist, things like I was there in 2000. I lived overseas in Egypt for
Yeah.
15 years and other places. And I went and I just dropped into the Sydney games with a buddy scuba diving and I managed to get a press pass. And I remember going to the press conferences right after and seeing people like Marion Jones, so sincere, talking about the disgust she had for her husband using performance enhancing drugs. When we see these people that had to keep up that facade, what soul crushing it must have been to lie and say, one day I'm going to get caught. Thanks for your time, Steve. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and good luck on everything you're doing and keep making a great difference in the world with people.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. And it's been a great period of time to just go reminisce a little bit. And I haven't talked about this kind of thing in many years. So thank you for the opportunity.